So in this study, we're going to look at evidence from outside the Gospels, which talk about Jesus, that give us some idea of who Jesus was and what he did. So big question, is Jesus mentioned apart from in the Gospels? And the answer is yes, he was. Mythicists say no, he's an important figure. He's the major character in a world religion. The Romans should have known all about him, and he should have appeared in all the Roman histories and literatures. And there's a list from a chap called Remsburg that lists more than 20 figures that should include Jesus, and he says they don't. Actually include things like cookery books and the life of Alexander the Great, which weren't likely to include anything about Jesus. But nonetheless, he says it is not there. In fact, Jesus is there. There's plenty of stuff which mentions Jesus outside the Gospels. So the other thing to think about is that Roman historians talked about things of interest to them. Mainly they were political writers, so they wanted people of political significance in Rome in their day. Jesus was a very minor figure as far as they were concerned. He came from a remote province, not even from Judea. In fact, at the time that Jesus was teaching, where he came from was outside the empire. It hadn't been incorporated yet. It was incorporated a decade or so later. And he's a fairly obscure prophet to them. They're not Jewish. This is a Jewish character, and they just hardly notice him. But in spite of that, he gets mentioned by actually quite a lot of documents. There's some categories of documents that mention him. There are Roman writers, there are Jewish writers. He appears, of course, in the letters in the New Testament, definitely written by people like Paul. He appears in Christian sources outside the Bible, and he appears in the writings of people who are attacking Christianity. So we've got all sorts of evidence of Jesus. The Roman writers, we can break them into categories. The historians are mentioning some important event, but in passing, they happen to mention Jesus. You've got some miscellaneous stuff. You've got a cryptic reference from Bar Serapion. We've got a letter that mentions Jesus. Some letters. We've got some satirists. They're opposing Jesus. They're opposing Christianity, but they're trying to undermine it. You'd expect them to mention if they thought Jesus didn't exist, but they don't. They assume Jesus. Well, they don't assume. They say Jesus existed. And we don't like him. And there's even the astronomers who discuss the darkness at Jesus' crucifixion. So again, it's worth thinking, why would Jesus not be mentioned? Well, first of all, ancient writers aren't necessarily writing about history. Some of them are writing novels or histories of some other person, or in one case, a cookery book. And Jesus is a very minor figure. He's not a king, he's not a governor, he's got no real political significance. And he didn't lead a revolt against Rome. And in fact, until rather later, when Christians become a bigger group, he has very little impact in Rome itself, which is where these writers often come from. There's one from Spain, but Jesus didn't have much impact in Spain until Christianity spread to Spain. And that's rather later. And things that we would consider important now aren't necessarily considered to be important by Roman writers. So a lot of them don't mention Jesus because they don't think it's important. You get other things like that. The big fire of Rome that in the time of Nero, major thing, mentioned by only 2 writers. Lots of other ones we can actually show were in Rome at the time of the fire, but didn't write about it. We know it happened because there's a layer of ash at the right level if you dig down. But it's not something that they mention a lot. And you've got to ask, why would they mention an obscure prophet in a remote province unless they were writing about that province? So let's look at some of the sources. Jewish traditions. There's the earliest Jewish traditions are oral, but around 200 AD, they started to write down some of these oral traditions, and we get the Mishnah, which is the central part of the Talmud. But there are other traditions that were written down that aren't in the Mishnah. A lot of them are collected together, a thing called the Toledot Jesu, but there's also, the Baraitha, which mention all sorts of things, not just Jesus, which are historical traditions. They're written down around the same time. Now they're 200 AD, they're 170 years after the resurrection, but they represent tradition that's been passed on orally, so it's a much earlier tradition which is now being written down before the people who pass it on begin to corrupt it. That's the idea. So even though it's written 200 AD, it's representing rather earlier evidence. And this is the big one. On the eve of the Passover, Jesus of Nazareth was hanged, and a herald went forth before him for 40 days, heralding Jesus the Nazarene is going to be stoned because he practiced sorcery and instigated and seduced Israel to idolatry. Now, this is a hostile picture of Jesus. No doubt that is not a Christian source, but it says various things about him. It tells us it's Jesus of Nazareth. It's talking about the same person, and he was hanged. It says, well, that's what crucifixion would be in Jewish law. It hadn't invented the long drop that later hanging was. This is exposed to death. This is hanged, crucified on the eve of the Passover, which is what the Gospels also say. The herald going forth for 40 days is, I think, a bit of a fiction. It's the idea is they're trying to prove that it wasn't their fault. And they've then got this idea of him being stoned. Doesn't match the being hanged bit, but it's the official penalty under Jewish law for what they're accusing him of. What they're accusing him of is sorcery. In other words, he did miracles and they couldn't explain them. And he instigated and seduced Israel to idolatry. In other words, he taught and they didn't agree with his teaching. It matches what's there in the Gospels, and it's certainly not a Jewish source. And there are other accounts. There's a reference Jesus had disciples, and it lists 5. Difficult to match them up with the disciples we know, but it does say he had disciples. There are references. There are occasional references to the virgin birth of Jesus, the son of Pandora, which is probably corruption of the word Parthenos, which means virgin in Greek. And there's a rather interesting story about a rabbi who is dying, and he asked them to send for one of Jesus' disciples who will be able to heal him, and another set of rabbis saying you can't do that, that would be against the Jewish law. And instead of rushing off to go and get help, they settle down to a rabbinic discussion as to whether it is or is not legal to get a Christian to heal you, at which point the chap dies before the discussion is over. But nonetheless, it accepts the idea that there is healing done by the disciples of Jesus. So it's quite interesting stuff, and it's earlier than the time it was written down. Look at some of the more Roman stuff, some of the opposition. Lucian of Samosata, he's writing somewhere between 170 and 180 AD, and he's writing a satire on the life of a chap called Peregrinus, who is a minor philosopher who Lucian really didn't like, and he satirizes like mad. And he has Peregrinus go and join the Christians for a while, who accept him as a great teacher, as he says. And he has a slight description of the Christians of the time, but he mentions Jesus, and of course he's quite happily undermining Christianity as well at the same time. But he doesn't suggest that Jesus didn't exist. He mentions Jesus in his writing, and he talks about a real person. More importantly, you've got Celsus. He writes the Logos Aletheis, the true word, which is designed as a direct attack on Christianity. Unfortunately, that book is actually lost. What we have is Origen contra Celsum against Celsus, written in the next century. But the way Origen opposes Celsus is he writes out what Celsus said, and then he writes out what he thinks of that, why he thinks it's wrong after that. So you can reconstruct Celsus's work by getting rid of the Origen bit, and you've just got Celsus. Of course, there might be more they didn't comment on. We don't know about that. We wouldn't, and it's possible that the order in which things were written wasn't quite the same as the order that Origen wrote them, but we can more or less reconstruct the true word, or at least the bit that Origen comments on. And he objects to Christ on a lot of grounds, but he's quite happy to accept that Jesus did miracles. He says they're not very good miracles, they're just healing a few poor people. You go to a marketplace in Egypt, and lots of people offer to do that for you. And he doesn't like the idea of the resurrection. He goes for the idea that the disciples stole the body. But nonetheless, he's finding every bit of mud he can sling at Christianity, and he doesn't include the idea that Jesus didn't exist. So, in fact, no critic of Christianity disputes the existence of Jesus up until the end of the 19th century. That's when you get Fraser and his Golden Bough. That's when this mysticism appears. A bit earlier, Suetonius, he writes a rather scurrilous account of 12 Roman emperors, which we know of as the 12 Caesars. And in that he mentions Christianity twice. So, one of them, rather minor mention in his account of Nero, is just this line: punishment was inflicted on the Christians, a class of men given to a new and mischievous superstition. Well, he's obviously not a Christian. He describes Christianity as a new and mischievous superstition. The mysticists tend to say, oh, that doesn't really count because it comes between passing laws about nut sellers and mime artists. Fair enough, it is mentioned in a rather minor context, but it's not a big political significance to Suetonius. He's interested in the rather scurrilous goings on within the families of the Caesars. Jesus doesn't match any of that. So it just an aside, but it's an aside, it's there. And these little tiny details are often more important than a big story. And the other one is in his account of Claudius. The reign of Claudius says that since the Jews constantly made disturbance at the instigation of Chrestus, he expelled them from Rome. Chrestus will probably be Christus, Christ. And there's some riot going on in Rome in the Jewish community. And Claudius expels the Jews from Rome. We can work out exactly when that is, and it matches the account we get in the Acts of the Apostles. In fact, there's the reference, Acts 18, verse 2. So we've got two references, one of which confirms a particular verse in the New Testament. The other one, while it mentions Christians, it shows Christians were around in Rome in sufficient numbers to be noticed in the reign of Nero. But they don't give you much information about Jesus. You don't have to go much earlier to get quite a bit of information. What they do tell us is that Christianity was in Rome in significant quantities during the reign of Claudius. Claudius is quite a bit earlier than Nero. Tacitus, 116 AD, and this one is the biggest account of Jesus, and it's really talking about the fire of Rome. There's this great big fire, burned down half the city of Rome, and the people blamed Nero for it. They thought Nero maybe had set fire in order to clear a bit of land because he wanted to build his own palace there in Rome. Golden House it was called. And So they were blaming Nero. Nero was becoming unpopular, so he decided to blame the Christians instead. And notice, well, the person writing it's not a Christian. He describes Christianity very briefly just to explain who these Christians are, and he calls it a mischievous superstition. And he says that it broke out even in Rome, where all things hideous and shameful from every part of the world find their center and become popular. Excuse the American spelling there. So this is not a Christian account, and he doesn't actually spell the word Christ correctly either. He describes them as a class hated for their abominations. There you go. If you're a Christian, that's what Tacitus thinks of you. But he describes Jesus as having been crucified, well, the death penalty anyway, in the reign of Tiberius, the emperor, at the hands of Pontius Pilate. So we've got a fairly significant description of Jesus there. And there it is. It's in Tacitus, 116 AD, less than a century, considerably less than a century after the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus. And in fact, he goes on then to talk about the persecution of Christians. And the important thing about them is he talks about it in them being an immense multitude. There's a lot of Christians in Rome at this stage. So Christianity had many followers, and even in Rome, it had many followers. It's growing quite well by this time. A little bit earlier again, only probably about a year earlier, we've got Pliny the Younger. He becomes governor of Bithynia. And there he finds he has a problem because the local temples are losing custom and Christianity is growing. So we think it's probably about 111 he becomes governor of Bithynia. He dies there in 113 AD. And to try to stop Christianity from closing down the local temples, he arranges a persecution. And he investigates Christianity while he's doing it. So what we can see is that by this stage, it was expected that Christianity should be persecuted. People are being denounced to him. They're saying, this guy's a Christian. He's got to work out what to do about it. And he knows that Christianity ought to be persecuted, but he's not quite sure of the details. And he writes a letter to Trajan, the emperor, saying, how do I persecute them? But he has a few of them tortured to make sure that they'll tell him the truth, and finds out what Christianity is about. And he says, well, they meet on a fixed day before dawn and sing responsively a hymn to Christ as though to a god. Rather interesting. Notice he doesn't say to Christ a god. He says to Christ like people do to a god. He discovered nothing else, he says, except for depraved, excessive superstition. Shows he's not a Christian. Christianity existed, and this involves a mention of Jesus and hymns which mention Jesus during Christian ceremonial, or whatever you want to call it. So 112 AD, and you've got a reference to Jesus there. Can't be later than 113 AD because that's when Pliny died. Josephus, even earlier, he more or less would be born just after the time of Jesus, or around that time. He writes, well, he wrote 2 big books, writes 4 books altogether, but two of them are big works of history. One of them, the Antiquities of the Jews. I've got it written down as AJ. The other one is the War of the Jews. Jesus comes in Antiquities. That's the last of his books, 93 AD. And, well, he's got a reference to John the Baptist, first of all. Now, that's not a direct reference to Jesus, but it confirms the gospel account of John the Baptist. There's another one which I'm putting second, although it's actually the last of them, and he refers to the death of James, the brother of Jesus, who was called the Christ. And you can track that down at 62 AD. And James is taken away by the Jewish leaders during a time when there's no Roman governor, and they have him stoned. There's a few others as well, but James is one of the people who is stoned there. And it mentions him as being the brother of Jesus, who was called the Christ. Doesn't explain what he means by that, but that suggests another reference somewhere else in the work, which describes that Jesus. And in fact, we've got that. We've got another reference, which is known as the Testimonium Flavium, the Flavian witness. And it's often disputed because it just seems too good. And there it is. At that time, they lived Jesus, a wise man, if indeed one might call him a man. It was he who wrote surprising works and was a teacher of such as accept the truth gladly. He won over many of the Jews and Greeks. He was the Christ. And it then talks about his death from Pontius Pilate and even his resurrection on the third day. People say, well, it can't be. Josephus is describing Christianity as the truth. He talks about the resurrection, but we've got Josephus's autobiography. He was not a Christian. What's going on? Well, I suspect that Josephus might have had friendly feelings towards Christianity. He might have respected it, even if he wasn't a Christian. And if he did, he would be wanting to keep a bit quiet about it because he depends on the emperor's patronage. If he starts saying, well, I think these Christians are really good, he's not going to lose that and maybe lose his life as well. So he keeps quiet about it. The Flavians weren't particular friends of Christianity. And it might be that he has sympathy with Christianity and includes things like that in there. Things that suggest that it was Josephus who wrote it, describe Jesus as a wise man. If someone asked you, what do you know about Jesus? You want to describe Jesus. The first thing that came to mind wouldn't be, oh, he was a wise man. You wouldn't say that. I have never heard Jesus describe any Christian as simply a wise man. Again, if one might call him a man, Christianity is absolutely certain Jesus was a man. Even the Trinity says he was a man. Says he was man and God. But everyone would happily call him a man. So again, it's not a Christian source that says that. And he refers to them as a tribe of Christians, which again is something that's totally outside the way we would describe the Christian community, any kind of, any point in history. It just doesn't work. So this passage does look like a bit of Josephus, but it is difficult to say why it is so complementary. The problem is we actually have quotations of this in various other works from all over the Roman Empire within the next 300 or 400 years, and they all have this. There is an Arabic version and a Syriac version which are write down the sort of Christian content, as it were, and some people say maybe those are the original and this is being changed. But if it's been changed, it's been changed very early on, and it's been then distributed as the main Josephus throughout. There's a bit of a puzzle why it's like that, but certainly it has bits of it that don't come from Christianity. It's mentioning Jesus and having some detail which is independent from Christianity. So, like I said, a lot of scholars say, well, yeah, it's original, but later Christian scribes changed it a bit. Things like on the third day appeared to him as rose to life have been added to it, maybe. But I think the evidence really is more strong for it being original than that. And of course, this bit is referred to in the death of James. It talks about who is the Christ. It doesn't try and say anything at all about Jesus, but if you go back to an earlier part of the work, it says there that Jesus was the Christ. What else have we got? Mara bar Serapion. Very strange. This is writing somewhere in 72, 73 AD when the Romans conquered Samosata and put him in prison. Some people say, well, maybe it was later when the Romans were driven out and Romans with Roman sympathies were put in prison by others, but he's supposedly put in prison by the Romans, and that only gives you 72, 73 AD. That's when the Romans overran Samosata. And he says, what advantage did the Jews gain from executing their wise king? It was shortly afterward their kingdom was abolished. And it says the wise king lived on his teaching that he'd given. And it's very difficult to work out who else this could be other than Jesus. I said it's a bit garbled, but maybe a reference to Jesus, executed by Jews but shortly before they were dispersed. He lives on, he says, and is known as a king. And that sort of fits Jesus, and it's difficult to think who else fits it better. So probably that's a reference to Jesus, 73 AD. So there's a chronology of references to Jesus. The Baraitha at this end, just a bit after 200 AD, they really refer back to traditions from maybe as early as 100 AD, maybe even earlier than that. We've got the satirists who are quite late, the flurry of historians round about the 100 AD mark, just after. We've got Marabas Serapion, who is writing right at the end of the Jewish wars. They're mopping up. I didn't mention that this astronomers. We've got Thales, who wrote about the darkness at Jesus' crucifixion, and Phlegon, who writes rather later. Thales probably earlier rather than later in that period, but it's very hard to date it. We haven't got Thales's book. What we have is quotations of Thales by other people. They argue about what he wrote about the darkness at Jesus' crucifixion. Phlegon, again, we haven't got Phlegon's original, but we have got quotations of it in other documents. So they're cited by ancient writers, Julius Africanus, Origen, people later than that. But they're confirmation of an event which a lot of skeptics will say never happened, but two ancient astronomers wanted to try and explain it. They try and explain it by an eclipse, or at least Thales does, but you couldn't have an eclipse of the sun at full moon. The moon has to get between the sun and the earth, and the later astronomers point this out. Of course, we've got the New Testament writings. We've got a letter, 48 AD, Galatians. It's the first verse of the New Testament to be written, and it mentions Jesus. We've got a gospel before 55 AD. We've got other gospels. John is very keen to, or at least John's amanuensis. He's got someone who is writing down what he says, very keen to say this is an eyewitness, and appears elsewhere in the gospel. So that takes you even earlier, and the Gospels and the letters are, of course, your best evidence of what Jesus did and said. You've got the Apostolic Fathers. These are people who would have met the apostles. They're writing shortly after the completion of the New Testament, towards the end of the 1st century and very early in the 2nd century. You've got the Muratorian fragment, which is really a catalogue of books in the New Testament, but mentions Jesus. You've got apocryphal writings, things like Pseudo-Barnabas, Pseudo-Clement, the people who are writing, claiming to be other people, but nonetheless, they're still witnesses of the existence of Jesus from fairly early times. We've got apocryphal gospels, in that the Gospel of Thomas or the Gospel of Peter mention Jesus. You've got various Gnostic works mention Jesus. So the mention of Jesus, there's quite a lot of stuff there. Not all of it accurate, but nonetheless, it's pretty certain Jesus existed. And there we go. Those are the other sort of Christian, but not biblical sources. And these are the pseudepigrapha that we've got. So again, they cover this same period very well. So Jesus outside the Gospels, a large amount of evidence from historians, satirists, rather cryptic Mara bar Serapion. We've got astronomers. We've got Jewish sources. We've got Gnostic sources. We've got Christian sources. We've got the letters. We've got the Apostolic Fathers. We have people writing in the name of other people, but nonetheless mentioning Jesus. We've got the Apocrypha. We've got the Muratorian fragment. A huge amount of evidence about Jesus, and they tell us very basic facts about Jesus which agree with what we have in the Gospels. And there we go.